in this chapter, I just want to give an introduction onto Azure Web Apps. Now, let's say that you want to host a web application on the Azure platform. So normally, or one way of doing this is to spin up an Azure virtual machine. Then you install the web server component, any other components that are required for deploying the application. Then finally, you deploy the application itself. Now, in such a case, when it comes onto the Azure VM, here you have to remember that you have to manage the virtual machine itself. You have to also manage other aspects such as the availability and scalability of the underlying infrastructure. Sometimes there is a requirement wherein a company does not want to actually manage the underlying infrastructure. They just want to have an environment for running that web application. Enter the use of Azure Web Apps. So this is a platform, has a service wherein the underlying infrastructure, that's including Azure virtual machines, are completely managed by the service itself. Here you can just go ahead and deploy the application onto the Azure Web App service. Here the entire infrastructure is actually managed for you. It has support for a variety of runtimes that includes .NET, .NET Core, Java, Python. So yes, when you're looking at deploying a web application onto the Azure Web App, you have to look whether the underlying runtime is supported. So this is a factor. Because see, what happens is when you actually deploy an Azure Web App, what it's doing in the background is it's probably running a set of virtual machines, and then it will install the required web server component, the required runtime, based on the runtime that is associated with that Azure Web App. So here the only difference is that everything is being done for you. Now, another quick note is when you deploy an Azure Web App, you also have to deploy something known as an Azure App Service Plan. The App Service Plan actually determines the features that are available for your Azure Web App. It also determines to a large extent what is a cost you're going to bear per month. Right, so in this chapter, I want to give first an introduction onto Azure Web Apps. Now over here, I'm on the pricing page when it comes to the app service. So when you actually go ahead and basically create a web app in Azure, you also need to go ahead and create something known as the app service plan. So the web app needs to be linked onto an app service plan. So there are two resources that you'll actually create in Azure. The app service plan is basically what you are built upon. Depending upon the type of app service plan that you choose, you will be billed accordingly. Based on the app service plan that you choose and based on your usage, you will be billed accordingly. Now, there are different types of app service plans in place. So over here, you can see all of the app service plans. For each of the plans over here, you basically have all of the required features of that app service plan. So this is a good page if you want to go ahead and compare all of the features. So let's do a comparison of just a couple of them. So first is the free and the shared app service plan. Now, when you go ahead and choose either plan, so if you go ahead and choose the free plan, you can go ahead and basically associate 10 web applications, mobile or API apps, and you get a disk space of 1 gigs. With the shared app service plan, you basically can host more number of applications, but you get the same amount of disk space. Now, one of the most important things to note when it comes to either the free or the shared app service plan. So if I go ahead and scroll down, so there is a limit when it comes to the amount of CPU minutes that you can actually consume per day. So when it comes to the free app service plan, so you can see that you only have a maximum of 60 CPU minutes per day. So that means if you had one Azure Web App running as part of the free app service plan, it can only run for 60 minutes in a day, 60 CPU minutes. And when it comes to the shared app service plan, you have a limitation of only 240 CPU minutes per day. So there are some limitations when it comes to using either the free or the shared app service plan. When you go on to the other plans, so from the basic plan onwards, you basically don't have those limitations. So with the basic app service plan, you have unlimited number of web applications, and I said you don't have any limitation when it comes to the amount of CPU minutes that can be consumed per day. Now in the basic app service plan, so you can see that for this particular setting, so we have something known as maximum instances. Here you can actually scale up to 3. So what does this actually mean when it comes to a feature? So over here, I just want to go ahead and give you that comparison. So let's say you go ahead and create an Azure app service plan. So this is based on the basic pricing tier. Now you can go ahead and create multiple Azure web applications and link it on to that app service plan. Because remember, as part of the basic app service plan, you have unlimited number of web applications that can be hosted as part of the app service plan. Now remember, this Azure Web App service is a PaaS service. It's a platform as a service, right? So it will go ahead and automatically basically create that compute infrastructure that is required for hosting the web applications. Now let's say that the app service plan creates one compute instance for, let's say, hosting 2 web applications. Then you go ahead and add a third web application, and now this compute instance is not enough to go ahead and withstand the load of all of the 3 web applications. So in Azure, you can actually see the metrics for the app service plan. So maybe the CPU percentage is going beyond a particular threshold that's based on this compute instance, and you may not get the ideal performance for now all 3 web applications. But because there is a support of up to 3 instances when it comes to the basic app service plan, you can actually go ahead and add another instance onto your app service plan. So this can be done by the plan itself, so that now your applications can be distributed across these 2 compute instances, so that the load gets distributed accordingly. So this is a benefit of the basic app service plans and higher. You basically get more number of compute power for hosting your set of web applications. So you don't need to go ahead and create multiple app service plans. You can just have one app service plan and have multiple web applications as part of that app service plan. But again, this also depends on what is the underlying programming language for that web application. So for example, you could go ahead and create an app service plan that spins up Windows-based virtual machines. This Windows-based virtual machine will not be able to run applications that are dependent on Linux. If you want to go ahead and host Linux-based web applications, you need to go ahead and create another separate app service plan. So the hosting of your web applications also depends upon the type of language that the web application is built on. Again, Azure Web Apps has support for a lot of programming languages. Right, so in this chapter, I want to give some idea behind the app service plan. So again, there are a lot of features that are available with the different app service plans. So now in this chapter, let's go ahead and see how to create a resource based on the Azure Web App service. So over here in all resources, let me go ahead and click on add. Now over here under the popular section, I can go ahead and choose web app. Over here, I'll go ahead and choose one of my existing resource groups. Now over here, we have to go ahead and give a unique web app name. So if I go ahead and don't give a unique name, so over here, it's doing a check for the uniqueness of the name. So it's not available. Right, so this name is available. Now, when it comes to the publish, I'll go ahead and choose code. Over here, now you can go ahead and decide what will be the underlying runtime stack that will be used for hosting your web application. So over here, we have a number of choices that are available. I'm going to go ahead and choose .NET Core 3.1. I'll leave it as Windows. Now over here in the region, let me go ahead and leave it as it is. Now, along with the web app, you need to have the app service plan. So based on the app service plan that you choose, you will actually get a number of features that will be available onto your Azure Web App. It will also determine to some extent, based on the usage of the app service plan, how much you're going to be billed. Now, by default over here, it is going ahead as per the wizard and creating a standard app service plan. But we can always go ahead and click on change size to go ahead and decide on the size for the app service plan. So if you go on to the dev test section, so over here you have the free app service plan wherein you can only go ahead and run for 60 minutes per day. Then you have the shared app service plan. So over here, you can see all of the features and the hardware that gets included with each app service plan. When you go on to the basic, that's when you start getting underlying compute machines that will be used for hosting your Azure Web Apps. So let me go ahead and choose basic and hit on apply. Let me go on to next for deployment. So at the moment, I won't choose, I'll disable deployment. I'll go on to monitoring. For the moment also, I'll go ahead and disable monitoring. I don't need application insights because at this point in time, we are looking at the Azure Web App itself. I'll go on to next for tags. I'll go on to review and create. And let's go ahead and create this instance of the Azure Web App. Now, this particular deployment is going to go ahead and create two resources. One is your Azure Web App and the other is the app service plan. Let's come back once this is complete. Now, once the deployment is complete, so we can go ahead on to the resource. So on the left-hand side, you will see a number of features that are available with the Azure Web App service. Now in the overview itself, over here, you'll have something known as a URL. So this is now the URL that you can actually go ahead and use to access this web app that is running in Azure. Now you can actually go ahead and copy this onto the clipboard. If you go on to a new tab, so over here, you can see a default page or like a default application that gets set up when you go ahead and deploy the Azure Web App. Right, so in this chapter, we have looked at how to deploy a resource based on the Azure Web App service. Now, in the last chapter, we had gone ahead and deployed a resource based on the Azure Web App service. Now, in this chapter, let's go ahead and just create a simple ASP.NET Core application. And let's go ahead and publish that application onto our Azure Web App from Visual Studio itself. So over here in Visual Studio, I'll go ahead and click on create a new project. Over here, I'll go ahead and search for ASP.NET Core. Then I'll go ahead and choose ASP.NET Core Web App and go on to next. Over here, let me go ahead and give a name and let me go on to next. Let me go ahead and choose this as .NET Core 3.1 and hit on create. Remember, when we create our web app, it was based on the framework of .NET Core 3.1. So now if you go ahead and run this application locally, right, so this is how it looks like. Now let's go ahead and publish this application onto our Azure Web App. So I'll go ahead and right click. I'll go ahead and hit on publish. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new publish profile. So I'll go ahead and choose Azure, go on to next. Over here, I'll go ahead and choose an Azure App Service Windows, since our Azure Web App is actually linked onto an app service plan that is based on Windows. I can go on to next. Over here, I can go ahead and choose my web app in Azure, and I can go ahead and hit on finish. So this will actually go ahead and create that publish profile. I'll go ahead and hit on publish. This will just take a minute or two. Now, once a publish is complete, so over here, let me go ahead and hit on enter to go ahead and refresh this page. And now you can see your web application. So you can actually go ahead, develop your applications in Visual Studio, and then you can actually go ahead and publish them directly onto your Azure Web App. Now in this chapter, I just want to go ahead and show you how you can create another Azure Web App and link it onto the same app service plan. So I do get this question from students asking me, can I go ahead and link multiple Azure Web Apps onto your app service plan? And the answer is yes, you can go ahead and do that. So remember, we had gone ahead and deployed a web app onto a particular app service. So if I actually go onto all resources, so over here, I have my app service and I have my app service plan. So remember that the Azure App Service Plan is responsible for building that compute infrastructure, which is responsible for running your web applications. And you can go ahead and create additional web apps and use the same app service plan, but there is a small caveat. So firstly, let me go ahead and click on add, and again I'll go ahead and choose web app. So over here, I'll go ahead and choose the same resource group. Over here, let me go ahead and give a new name. Right, so it is available. So I can go ahead and choose core. In the runtime stack, if I go ahead and let's say choose ASP.NET version 4.8. So over here, I can go ahead and choose Windows. If I go ahead and choose the same region as my first app service plan, so our app service plan, our original one. So again, if I go on to all resources in a new tab, so our app service plan, remember, is in the central US location. So if you want to go ahead and link another web app onto that same app service plan, they need to be in the same region. Over here, in this case, central US. So now over here, it's going to go ahead and choose that same app service plan. If it was going to go ahead and create a new one, it would be prefixed by the word new. But over here, it's using the same app service plan. But again, I said there's a small caveat. So over here, our original app service plan was based on the OS of Windows. Now ASP.NET version 4.8 can run only on Windows, and .NET Core can run either on Windows or on Linux. But our original app service plan was built only for Windows. We had chosen it as Windows. So that means the underlying compute infrastructure will be Windows-based servers that will be used for hosting your web applications. So if you had a runtime stack that was only supported on Linux, for example, if I go ahead and choose Ruby, so over here now, this particular runtime stack is only supported on Linux and not on Windows. And that is why now you can see over here, it is going to go ahead and create a new app service plan. It's going to go ahead and create now a Linux plan. So when you go ahead and create your app service plan, depending upon what you choose as the underlying OS, there will be some runtime stacks that are supported. So keep a note of this when it comes to building your infrastructure. Now again, I can go ahead and choose, let's say ASP.NET version 4.8. It'll go ahead and use the same app service plan. Again, go on to deployment. So I'll disable it. I'll go on to monitoring. So I'll go ahead and not create application insights. Let me go on to review and create. And let me go ahead and hit on create. Now, while this is being done in Visual Studio, let me go ahead and create now a new project. So now over here, let me go ahead and search for ASP.NET. So not for Core, for ASP.NET. Let me go ahead and scroll down and let me go ahead and search for. So over here, I'll go ahead and choose ASP.NET Web Application. I'll go on to next. So over here, I can see I have framework 4.7.2, so that should be fine. I'll just give a name, hit on create. Over here, you can go ahead and choose whatever type of template that you want for the web application. So I'll leave it as MVC. I'll go ahead and hit on create. Once this is in place, you can go ahead and run the application locally. So this is what the application looks like. So going back onto Azure, I can see now I have my web app in place. And if I go on to all resources, so over here you can see now I have two web apps and only one app service plan. So both of the web apps are linked onto the app service plan. So remember, you get charged basically based on the consumption of the app service plan. If you actually go on to the app service plan itself, so over here in the overview itself, so if I go ahead and just hide this, so you will get metrics on the amount of CPU utilization, the memory utilization. This is of the underlying virtual machines that are already being spun up and maintained by Azure themselves as part of this app service plan that is hosting your web applications. If you go ahead and scroll down, you will see all the apps that are actually part of the app service plan. So there are two of them. If you look at the file system storage, over here, you will see different aspects about the file system storage. Over here, so you can see the threshold, you can see the various details, etc. So now let me go back on to Visual Studio. Again, quickly, if I go on to, the web apps. So over here, I'm going on to my app services. So going on to app services. Let me go on to our new web app. So once I have the URL, I'll go ahead and copy it, go on to a new tab. And over here, again, we should see our default web application running as part of the Azure Web App. Now in Visual Studio, again, right click, hit on publish, again, create a new publish profile. So I'll go ahead and choose Azure. Go on to next. I'll go ahead and choose Azure App Service Windows. Go on to next. So over here, let me go ahead and choose that new web app, hit on finish. And then let me go ahead and hit on publish. And again, let's wait for a minute or two. Now, once the publish is complete, I'll go ahead and refresh this page. And now you can see you have your web application in place. Right, so in this chapter is for kind of explain the concept that you can have multiple web apps running as part of that app service plan. Now, as part of the exam objectives, so if I go ahead and scroll down, I'm talking about the Azure App Service. There is something known as how do you configure the connection strings. So over here, connection strings is wherein you want to go ahead and connect your Azure Web App onto a database itself. So what we are going to do in our lab is we're going to go ahead and have an extensive set of chapters on how we can connect our Azure Web App onto an Azure SQL database. Now you can go ahead and connect your web application onto multiple data sources. So you might go ahead and connect your web application onto, let's say, an Oracle database or a Microsoft SQL Server database or MongoDB or even MySQL. So over here, you need to go ahead and have the connection string part of your application. Your application will then go ahead and use that connection string to go ahead and connect onto the database. Now in our exercise, in order to go ahead and show you how to use connection strings, we are going to go ahead and create a new instance of an Azure SQL database. The Azure SQL Database is a platform, has a service offering that is available in Azure. Over here, the underlying infrastructure for maintaining the SQL database is completely managed by Azure. So instead of you going ahead, creating a virtual machine, installing the database software and maintaining all of those aspects, you can go ahead and quickly spin up a SQL database. This is actually based on Microsoft SQL Server Engine to have a database up and running in Azure. So that is what we are going to do. We'll go ahead and first build an instance based on the Azure SQL Database service. Then we'll go ahead and develop a .NET program that will just do a simple connection and retrieval of data from the database. We will then go ahead and publish our application onto the Azure Web App, and we'll see how to make use of connection strings to go ahead and connect onto the Azure SQL database. So now here in Azure, I'm in all resources. The first thing we will do is to go ahead and create a new Azure SQL database. So over here, let me go ahead and click on add. And over here, let me go ahead and choose a SQL database. Now, please note that from an exam perspective, you are not required to understand the Azure SQL database service. I said I'm doing this purely from the perspective of understanding connection strings. So I'm just going ahead and using Azure SQL database as a simple use case scenario. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and choose one of the existing resource groups that I have. So this is a completely managed service. Over here, I just need to go ahead and give details about the database and the database server, which will be used for hosting the database itself. So over here, I'll give a name for the database, and over here, I'll hit on create new for the server. I have to go ahead and give a unique server name. Right, so now it's unique. You have to go ahead and give credentials which will be used for logging into the database server. So these are your own credentials. Please keep a note of these credentials, and you have to go ahead and give a proper password that conforms onto the password restrictions. If you go ahead and just give a simple password, over here you can see what are the restrictions for specifying the password. So I'm going to go ahead and specify a password that meets all of that criteria. Over here, I'll go ahead and leave the location as it is. I'll go ahead and hit on OK. Now over here in configuring the database, so it goes ahead and defaults onto the general purpose tier, which is quite expensive. So since this is just a demo, I'm going to go ahead onto the basic, standard, and premium. So this is based on something known as the D2 model. That's the database transaction units model. And I'm going to go ahead and choose basic. So over here, if you look at the cost, it's just $5 per month. And anyway, after this exercise, I'm going to go ahead and delete the database itself. So I'll go ahead and hit on apply. I'll go on to next for networking. Now over here, I am going to go ahead and enable the public endpoint so that we can actually connect onto the database server. So there's a server that's going to be hosting your database. And over here, I'll say, please go ahead and add my current client IP address so I can connect onto the database server. And if I want other Azure services, such as let's say my Azure Web App to also connect onto the database server, I can go ahead and turn on this option as well. I'll go on to next for security. I won't do anything. I'll go on to additional settings. I won't do anything. I'll go to tags. I'll go on to review and create. And let me go ahead and hit on create. Now, if you want to go ahead and connect onto this database server, this database itself, you can go ahead and use a tool known as SQL Server Management Studio. This is a freely available tool. So you can go ahead and search for SQL Server Management Studio, and you can go ahead onto the download link. And over here, you can go ahead and download SQL Server Management Studio. This is a freely available tool. I've already gone ahead, I've downloaded the tool and I've installed it. So now let's wait till the deployment is complete for our Azure SQL database. Now, once the deployment is complete, you can go ahead onto the resource. So now this wizard has gone ahead and created two resources. One is an Azure SQL database and another is a database server. So over here, the name of your database is appdb and this is the server name. Now you will actually go ahead and use this server name to log on to the database server. So you can go ahead and copy the server name over here. I've gone ahead and opened up SQL Server Management Studio. So as I mentioned before, this is a tool that you can go ahead and download. Once you go ahead and open SQL Server Management Studio, over here, you can go ahead and first of all, give what is the server name. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it over here. In the authentication, go ahead and choose SQL Server Authentication. And then over here, go ahead and give the username and password, which was used during the creation. Remember in the wizard, when you created the database server, you mentioned the details of the database server. That time you had gone ahead and mentioned the username and password. And then you can go ahead and hit on connect. So once you are connected, you can see your database server over here. On the databases, you'll see your AppDB database. Now what we are going to do is that we are going to go ahead and execute these commands. So I want to go ahead and create now a table within the database. The name of the table is course. It has three columns: the course ID, the course name, and the rating. So a simple table to go ahead and store information about courses. And then I'm going to go ahead and use insert statements to go ahead and insert three records into this table. So let's go ahead and do that. So let me go ahead and copy all of these statements. Then I'll right click on the database and I'll go ahead and choose new query. I'll paste all of the commands in the query window. I can go ahead and select the first command to create a table, and then I can go ahead and hit on execute. So it will go ahead and create a table. You can also go ahead and verify. In Object Explorer, you can go ahead and expand the database. So this just takes a little bit of time. You can go on to the tables. And now over here, I can see my course table in place. Now let me go ahead and issue these three statements to go ahead and insert data into the table. So I'll go ahead and hit on execute. So now it has gone ahead and inserted the data. And now let me go ahead and choose the data from the underlying table just to confirm that we have the data in place. And yes, we do have the data in place. So now in this chapter, we have gone ahead and created our data store, wherein we are using a resource based on the Azure SQL Database service. Now, in the last chapter, we had gone ahead and created our Azure SQL Database. Now, in this chapter, I'll go ahead and create an ASP.NET Core web application that will be used to go ahead and interact with the data that we have in our database. So firstly, in Visual Studio, let me go ahead and create a new project. Over here, I'm going to go ahead and choose an ASP.NET Core empty application, an empty template. I'll go on to next. So over here, I'll go ahead and give a name for the project. I'll go on to next. So I'll leave it as .NET 3.1 and let me go ahead and hit on create. Now let me go ahead and first create the folders. So firstly, I'm going to go ahead and create a models folder. So this we can go ahead and use to create classes that represent our data. Then I'll go ahead and create a new folder for services. We'll go ahead and create a service that will interact with our Azure SQL Database. Then I'll go ahead and create a controller. So we'll base this on the MVC pattern. So I'll go ahead and create controllers. And I'll go ahead and create another folder for the views. Now, once this is done in the models, let me go ahead and right click and let me go ahead and add a new class. So this will be our course class. So over here, let me go ahead and enter some code. So over here, I have properties. These properties actually map onto what we have in terms of the columns of our table in our database. So our course ID, the course name, and the rating. So if you go on to the SQL database, I have the course ID, the course name, and the rating. So I've gone ahead and mentioned the data type as an integer, a string, and a decimal. Now let me go ahead and create a service. We are going to go ahead and use this service to actually go ahead and interact with the data that we have in our Azure SQL Database table. So I'll go ahead and name this as course service. So over here, let me go ahead and again add some code. So over here, let me go ahead and explain the code that I've added. So firstly, just some strings to go ahead and represent how we are going to connect on to the database. This is one way of doing it. You can actually go ahead and also take the database string directly, and I'll show that in a later chapter. Over here, we have to go ahead and mention what is the database server name. So I'll go ahead onto Azure. I'll copy it over here. Going back on to Visual Studio, let me replace it over here. Then I'll go ahead and mention the username and the password. So this is the password that I actually mentioned for the Azure SQL Database server. And this is the name of our database. Now I'm going ahead and making use of the SQL classes which are available to go ahead and interact with the SQL database. For this, I need to go on to Tools. I need to go on to NuGet Package Manager and go ahead and choose Manage NuGet Packages for the solution. I'll go on to Browse. I'll search for SQL. And over here, I'm going to go ahead and choose system.data.sql client. I'll choose that and hit on install. Again, please note over here, I am not using the entity framework. You are more than welcome to go ahead and use whatever framework is more applicable to you. I just want to go ahead and show a simple way to interact with the Azure SQL database. Now going back onto my course service. So let me go ahead and ensure that now I include the namespaces over here. So using system.data.sql client. So everything is fine over here. I need to go ahead and ensure that I also include my models, which has my course. So over here, what I'm trying to do is that I'm creating now a list of courses. Over here, I want to go ahead and first establish a connection onto my database. And then using the SQL command, I want to go ahead and issue this statement against my database so that I get all the courses for my course table. And then over here, using the SQL data reader, I'm reading through all of the rows that are returned, and then I'm adding it to the list. I am closing my connection, and as part of this method of get courses, I'm going ahead and returning that list. Right, so over here, this is basically my course service. Now I want to ensure that I inject this service. So I'll go on to my startup class. So over here, let me go ahead and ensure that I add MVC. This is basically for my model view controller framework. And also let me go ahead and also add my service. So add transient and then my course service. Let me go ahead and ensure to include the namespace. To also ensure to have the right routing in place. So over here, just adding the proper routing method for my MVC project. So I have my model in place. I have my service in place. Now let me go ahead and add a controller. So an empty MVC controller. I'll click on add. Over here, I'll name this as course. I'll click on add. Again, over here, let me go ahead and just replace some code. So over here, I want to go ahead and make use of that course service, which is available through dependency injection. And over here, let me go ahead and also include SQL app.models. And I want to get all of the courses and I want to go ahead and return it onto my view. So now let's go ahead and quickly construct the view. So in views, I need to go ahead and first create a new folder. So over here, this should be my course folder, which maps onto my controller over here. And let me go ahead and add a new view. So erase a view. I'll click on add. I'll leave it as index and click on add over here. And let me go ahead and just replace this code. So over here now has the model. I'm going ahead and using SQL app.models.course. So small SQL. And in this code, I'm making use of Bootstrap. So over here, I'm ensuring to have the cascading style sheet in place, right? Then I go ahead and scroll down. So I'm creating a very simple table. And over here for each course that I actually have in my model, I'm going ahead and displaying the course ID, the course name, and the rating. So let me go ahead and hit on save, and let me go ahead and run this project. So now over here, you can see the data in place. So it's picking up all of this data from our Azure SQL database. If you want to go ahead and actually confirm, so for the first course, the rating is 4.5. So over here, we can go ahead and actually make a change. So I can say update the course table, set rating is equal to 4.7, where the course ID is equal to 1. Let me go ahead and execute this, right? So that is done. If I go ahead and just refresh this page, you can see the rating is now 4.7. So now you have an application, a simple application that is going ahead and pulling data out of an Azure SQL database table. Now, in the previous chapter, we had seen how to develop a simple .NET program that will be used to go ahead and connect onto our Azure SQL Database server. Now, first of all, I want to go ahead and make a change wherein I do want to actually go ahead. Let me go ahead and just stop my program first. So I do want to actually go ahead and have all of these connection details over here within the program itself. I want to go ahead and have it has a proper connection string. So I'm going to go firstly onto my core service and I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this. Next, I'm going to go onto the app settings.json file. So over here, you can go ahead and specify, configuration settings that you want to pick up from your code. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and just replace this with just connection strings. So over here, I'm going ahead and defining a name for my connection string. And over here, I have to go ahead and get the entire connection string. So for that, I am going to go onto my AppDB database. Over here in connection strings, I'll say show database connection strings. Over here, let me go ahead and copy all of this onto the clipboard. And let me go ahead and paste it over here. Now, when you paste it over here, you have to go ahead and change what is a password. So what is a password for your Azure SQL Database server? So let me go ahead and replace it over here. This is very important. Let me go ahead and click on save. So in ASP.NET Core, you can actually go ahead and specify connection strings in the app settings.json file. Again, it depends upon the framework you're using. It's not the same if you're using, let's say, ASP.NET version 4.8 or 4.7. This is for ASP.NET Core, and currently I'm on version 3.1. Now I want to go ahead and get this connection string. So I'm going to go on to first my controller. So I'll go on to my course controller. And over here, let me go ahead and get a configuration object. So over here, I can go ahead and use the Microsoft.extensions.configuration namespace. Then I'll go ahead and ensure that I get this accordingly in my controller constructor. And then I'll set it onto my configuration. And then now over here, when I'm going ahead and calling my get courses method, which is part of my course service, I can now go ahead onto the configuration. I can go ahead and get the connection string and what is the name of my connection string. Now, obviously, I need to go ahead and make a change onto my course service. So now over here, let me ensure that I do get now a connection string, and then I don't need all of this anymore. Over here, I can go ahead and directly use that connection string. Over here also, let me go ahead and add the same. So in my get courses, the connection string, and let me go ahead and also pass the connection string over here. So the only difference is now I'm going ahead and getting the connection string from the app settings.json file. Let me go ahead and run this program. Right, so it's still working. Now let's go on to the next chapter, wherein we'll actually go ahead and now publish this onto an Azure Web App. So in the last chapter, we had gone ahead and made the settings wherein now our code is picking up the connection strings from the app settings.json file. Now in Azure, let me go on to all resources and let me go ahead and add a new web app resource. So I'll go ahead and choose web app. Over here, let me go ahead and choose a resource group. I'll give a unique web app name. I'll choose the runtime stack as .NET Core 3.1. Over here, I'll allow it to go ahead and create a new app service plan. I'll disable it. Don't need monitoring as well. Contacts, go on to review and create. And let me go ahead and hit on create. Let's wait till the deployment of the web app is complete. Now, once the deployment is complete, I'll go ahead on to the resource. Now let's go on to our project and let me go ahead and publish this on to the Azure Web App. So I'll go ahead and choose Azure, choose Azure App Service, go on to next. Over here, I'll go ahead and choose the SQL app, click on finish. And let me go ahead and hit on publish. Now once the publish is complete, so over here, if I go on to the URL, if I go on to a new tab, so I should be seeing my application working, and this is still fine. But over here, please remember that now the connection string for the Azure SQL Database server is being picked up from our app settings.json file. But if you want to go ahead and store now this connection string within the Azure Web App service itself, this is something that you can do. So firstly, what I'll do is that let me go on to the Azure Web App. Over here, I'll go on to configuration. Let me go ahead and just hide this. Now in the configuration, I'll go on to connection strings. So you can go ahead and define your connection strings over here. I'll go ahead and choose new connection string. Over here in the type, I'm going to go ahead and choose SQL Azure. Now the name is going to be the same name that I have over here. So SQL connection. So I'll place it over here. And this is the entire value, the entire connection string. So I'll go ahead and copy it from here. And I'll go ahead and place it over here. And let me go ahead and hit on OK. And let me go ahead and hit on save and continue. So now I am embedding this connection string instead of in my code in the Azure Web App itself. So now going back on to my app settings.json file on my local machine, let me go ahead and remove all of this and place the previous code which was there. So I don't have the connection string here anymore. I'll go ahead and save this, and now let me go ahead and publish my app again. So I'll go ahead and hit on publish. I'll use the same profile and let me go ahead and hit on publish over here. So now ideally our Azure Web App, our application, should actually go ahead and pick up now the connection string which is defined as part of the Azure Web App itself. Let me just wait for the publish to complete. Now once the publish is complete, you can go ahead and just take the same URL. You can go on to a new tab. And you can see we are still getting our list of services. Again, if you want to go ahead and confirm, over here, let's go ahead and again change the rating. Let me go ahead and refresh this page, and you can see it's changed over here. Now this chapter was not only meant to go ahead and give you an understanding of the connection strings settings, but also to give you an idea on how you can use a data store in Azure, such as an Azure SQL database. Now in this chapter, I want to go through the continuous deployment feature, which is available as part of Azure Web App. So when you go ahead and create a resource based on the Web App service, if you go on to the deployment page, so over here you have the ability to actually go ahead and either disable or enable something known as GitHub Actions. So over here, this actually allows you to go ahead and do a continuous deployment of your application onto the Azure Web App from, let's say, source code that is hosted in a GitHub repository. So over here, if I go ahead and fill in all of the required details quickly, if I go ahead and choose an underlying runtime stack, and if I go on to next, so over here you can go ahead and enable continuous deployment. And over here you can go ahead and select the repository in GitHub, where you can actually go ahead and ask Azure Web App to pick up the code. So Azure Web App will actually go ahead and pick up your code from a GitHub repository. It will go ahead and automatically do the build of your code, and it will go ahead and deploy it as a web application. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how you can do it for an existing Azure Web App. So over here, if I go on to app services, so I have two web apps in place. If I go on to the first one, so this is based on the framework of .NET Core 3.1. If I go ahead and copy the URL onto the clipboard, so currently I have one web application running over here. Now in another tab, so over here, I'm in GitHub. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in with my GitHub account. Now, if you don't have a GitHub account, it is very easy to go ahead and create a GitHub account. You can just go ahead and sign up. Since I already have a GitHub account in place, I can go ahead and sign in. So just going ahead and entering my required details. And over here, we have the GitHub page. Now in Visual Studio, what I'll do is that let me go ahead and create a new project. So over here, I'll go ahead and choose ASP.NET Core. So I'll go ahead and search for ASP.NET Core Web App. Go on to next. Over here, I'll go ahead and give a project name. Let me go on to next. I'll choose the long-term support and hit on create. Now over here, what I'll do is that I'll go on to the pages. I'll go on to the index page. And over here, let me go ahead and write welcome to GitHub. Let me go ahead and hit on save. Now, what I'll do is that let me go ahead and first publish this entire code onto GitHub. So it's also very easy. Now, I'm currently using the latest version of Visual Studio 2019, and it has direct integration with GitHub. So over here, you can see something known as Git, and you can go ahead and choose Create Git Repository. So it's going to go ahead and provide you with a screen wherein it will first go ahead and initialize a local Git repository. Since I've already logged in before on this machine from Visual Studio onto GitHub, so it's going ahead and taking my GitHub account. If not, you can go ahead and click on add an account, and then you can go ahead and add your username and password for GitHub. It will also go ahead and create a new repository in your GitHub account known as Git App. And if you want, you can go ahead and make this as a public repository. So it will go ahead, create a local Git repository, create a new GitHub repository, and also publish your code onto GitHub on one screen itself. It will do all of the steps at one time. So let me go ahead and hit on create and push. So over here, now you can see lock symbols in place for your different files. So that means now this is being version controlled with Git. Now over here, if I go ahead and refresh this page, so now I can see my Git app repository in place. And over here, you'll actually see all of the source code files. So over here, if you go on to pages, if you go on to the index page, over here, you can see welcome to GitHub. So now we have our local project in Visual Studio that is being version controlled in GitHub. Now we can tell our Azure Web App service to go ahead and pick up this code and deploy it onto the web app itself. So if I go onto my web app, if I go onto Deployment Center, let me go ahead and just hide this so we have a better view of Deployment Center. Over here, you can go ahead and choose your source control. So is your code in GitHub? Or is your code in Azure repos? So this is part of Azure DevOps. Or is it part of a local Git repository? Or is it part of Atlassian Bitbucket? This is another version control tool that is available. So it has integration over here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose GitHub. Now over here, it is signed in again with my account. Again, if you're not signed in, you can go ahead and click on the process for signing in over here itself. Then I'll go ahead and choose my organization. It's not an organization, basically. I don't have any organization in GitHub. It is basically choosing your own account. Over here, we have to go ahead and select now our repository. So it's going ahead and picking up all my repositories in GitHub. So I'll go ahead and choose the GitHub repository. Over here, you can go ahead and create multiple branches. By default, there is a master branch, so I'm not making this very complicated. So when you go ahead and upload your code, it will go ahead and create something known as a master branch. Now, when it comes to Git, the entire functioning of Git, this is mostly part of the Azure DevOps exam. So if you want to go ahead and look at the working of Git, then I also have a course on AZ-400, that's Azure DevOps, where I go ahead and explain the working of Git in much more detail. Over here, I'm just giving all of the core aspects wherein we can actually go ahead and create this automatic deployment onto our Azure Web App. Over here, let me go ahead and then click on Save once I have all of these settings in place. So now it's creating an internal workflow, wherein now if we go ahead and make any sort of change basically onto our code in GitHub, it will actually go ahead and ensure that it picks up that change code from GitHub and deploys it onto the Azure Web App. Now, if you want to do an initial sync of the code in the GitHub repository onto the Azure Web App, because currently for this web app, if you go onto the home page, it's only welcome. If you go onto the app, you can go ahead and click on sync, and you can go ahead and perform a manual deployment operation. So let's wait for a couple of minutes. Now, once all of this is in place, let's just wait for a couple of minutes. I want to see now if the Azure Web App, based on our initial settings, so it's going to go ahead and actually perform an initial sync. It'll go ahead and now take the code from our GitHub repository and deploy it onto our Azure Web App. Now I've waited for a couple of minutes. Now let me go ahead and just refresh this page. And now you can see welcome to GitHub. So now the Azure Web App, along with a deployment feature, has actually gone ahead and picked up the code automatically from GitHub. And remember, now this is a continuous deployment process. So if you go back onto GitHub, if you go onto your index page over here, if I go ahead and just edit this file, and over here, let me go ahead and just change the file. Then I'll go ahead and scroll down, and over here, let me go ahead and commit the changes onto the master branch. So let me go ahead and hit on commit. So let's say another developer has now gone ahead and made this change. So now your web app is going to go ahead and pick up these changes which are made onto GitHub. It's going to go ahead, it'll be triggered, it'll take the code, and it will deploy it onto the web app itself. So again, let's wait for a couple of minutes. So after waiting for a couple of minutes, if I go ahead and refresh this page, so now over here, I can see welcome to GitHub version 1. So now remember, the code is being picked up automatically from GitHub. At any point in time, if you want to go ahead and ensure the connection is not there between GitHub and your web app, you can always go ahead and disconnect and reconnect at a later point in time. Now in this chapter, I want to go through how you can map a custom domain onto your Azure Web App. Now over here in Azure, I have an Azure Web App in place. It's currently based on the standard app service plan. Now by default, every Azure Web App gets a unique URL. So over here, if you go ahead and take the URL, and if I go ahead and just copy it onto a tab in a browser, so over here I have the web application in place. But let's say now you want to go ahead and map your own custom domain name onto this web application. So how would you do that? Now, the first thing that you need to do is to go ahead and have a domain in place, a publicly routable domain on the internet. So you have to go ahead and buy a domain. So over here, since custom domains is a part of the objectives of the exam, I have to go ahead and show you how to map a custom domain. Now I've already gone ahead and bought a domain from an external domain provider. So over here it's GoDaddy. Now if you go onto your Azure Web App, if you go ahead and scroll down, there is something known as custom domains. So if a company already has a domain name in place, they can go ahead and map that custom domain onto this Azure Web App. Over here, you can go ahead and click on Add Custom Domain. And over here, you have to go ahead and give the domain name. So over here, my domain name is cloudportalhub.com. Now, if you go ahead and click on Validate, over here, you can do the validation either via a CNAME record or via an A record. So these are records that you actually add onto your external domain provider. So over here, you can see I have some records already in place. So normally every external domain provider has this facility wherein you can go ahead and add this DNS records. Now over here, in order to go ahead and map that CNAME, I have to go ahead and scroll down. And over here, it's telling me that the Azure Web App service needs to first verify that I basically own the domain. Now, in order to go ahead and verify this, I could go ahead and either add something known as a TXT record in my external domain provider, or I could go ahead and add a CNAME record. So either of these records will do. So I'm going to go ahead and add a CNAME record. So I have to go ahead and add a CNAME record with the host of www, and over here, this is the value. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'll go on to my external domain provider. So I already have a record in place. If you don't have a CNAME record in an external domain provider, so I said that they should be having this facility to go ahead and add records. So over here, if I go ahead and click on add, I can actually go ahead and add a new CNAME record. Over here, I can go ahead and add the host, and over here, I can go ahead and add that value, which is nothing but the DNS name, the current DNS name that is assigned onto my Azure Web App. But because I already have a CNAME record in place, let me go ahead and just edit this record. And over here, in terms of the point to, I'll go ahead and copy paste that particular URL. And let me go ahead and hit on save. Now it could take around 5 to 10 minutes for this to actually reflect, because over here in custom domains, if I go ahead and click on validate again, it should ideally go ahead and verify the domain ownership. And once the domain ownership is actually verified, I can go ahead and then add this as a custom domain. So I'll go ahead and come back after a duration of around 10 minutes. Now I waited for around 10 minutes. Now let me go ahead and click on validate again. So it'll go ahead and do a validation. And now I can see it has gone ahead and verified the domain ownership. And now I can go ahead and click on add custom domain. So now I'm mapping a domain onto this Azure Web App. Over here, I can go ahead and click on OK. And now I can see my domain in place. Over here, since I'm not using HTTPS currently at the moment, that's why it's showing as not secure. But now in another tab, if I go ahead and copy this URL, so over here it's saying our connection is not private, and that's fine. I'll go on to advanced. let me go ahead and proceed on to www.cloudportalhub.com. And now we are being redirected onto our application. So over here, I just want to go ahead and show you how you can map your own custom domain name onto an Azure Web App. Hi and welcome back. Now in this chapter, I want to go ahead and show you how you can implement SSL for your Azure Web Apps. So over here, I've gone ahead and mapped a custom domain onto one of my Azure Web Apps. So if I go ahead and copy the URL, if I go on to a new tab, so it's a simple ASP.NET Core application. So over here, let me go ahead and proceed on to cloudhublearning.com. And so over here, it's showing us not secure. So how can we make our site secure? So there is an easy way to go ahead and implement this. So if you go on to your Azure Web App, if you go ahead and scroll down, if you actually go on to the TLS SSL settings, over here, if you go on to private key certificates, if you already have a certificate in place for your website, you can go ahead and upload that. But over here, you can go ahead and create an app service managed certificate for free. So this is something that is available with the Azure App Service. So if I go ahead and click on this, so it will go ahead and look at the hostname eligibility. So it is available. I'll go ahead and hit on create. So it will go ahead and create an SSL certificate that is only available for this Azure Web App. Now, once you have the app managed certificate in place, it could just take a minute or two. Now you can actually go ahead on top. You can go on to bindings. And now over here, you can go ahead and add an SSL binding. So now over here, you can actually go ahead and bind your custom domain onto the certificate that just got created. Over here, let me go ahead and click on add binding. So let's wait till this is complete. Now, once the binding is complete, so let me go ahead and close this again. I'll go on to the overview. And now over here, you'll notice it's HTTPS and not HTTP anymore. You can go ahead and copy it onto the clipboard, go on to a new tab. And now you can see the site is secure. The connection is secure because it has a valid certificate. So in Azure Web Apps, you do have an easy way to go ahead and enable SSL. Hi and welcome back. Now in this chapter, I want to go through the logging feature which is available as part of Azure Web Apps. So you get a set of logging features that are available for the Azure Web App service. Now there are different types of logging that are available. You can go ahead and perform application logging. This captures log messages that are generated by your application code. You have web server logging. This records raw HTTP request data. You have detailed error messages. This stores copies of the .html error pages that would have been sent onto the client browser. You have deployment logging. These are logs when you publish content onto an application. And you could also go ahead and stream logs in real time. So let's go ahead on to Azure. Just want to go ahead and show you some of the logging features that are available. So over here, we are in Azure. Now I have an Azure Web App in place. Now if I go ahead and scroll down, so if I look at the monitoring section, we have something known as app service logs, and we have something known as the log stream. So if I go on to the app service logs, so over here is where you can actually go ahead and turn on the different types of logging. So by default, all of this is off. So you can go ahead and turn on application logging. You can go ahead and turn on application logging at the blob level. So if you have an Azure storage account itself, you can actually go ahead and direct logs onto that storage account. else you could go ahead and direct the logs onto the file system itself. So over here, we are talking about the underlying file system that is part of the virtual machines that are spun up as part of the app service plan. So over here, let me go ahead and choose information for application logging. You could also go ahead and turn on web server logging, detail error messages, and failed request tracing as well. So over here, let me go ahead and also turn on web server logging. And then you could go ahead and specify what is the retention in days. So if you only want to go ahead and retain the logs for, let's say, a day, you can go ahead and specify this setting accordingly. And then you can go ahead and click on save. Right, so you have this in place. Now let me quickly just go ahead on to the overview, and let me go ahead and take the URL and let me go on to a new tab. Now, one way to see the logs is to actually, if I go back onto the app service logs. So over here, you could go ahead and use an FTP tool, and you can go ahead and FTP onto the URL that is given over here. This will actually allow you to look at that log data. Or you could also go ahead onto the log stream. So if you go onto the log stream, you'll actually get a real-time view of both your application logs and your web server logs as well. So in order to see logs, you're seeing the logs right now. So if there are any sort of GET requests, so someone is going ahead and basically getting this particular page, it's going and browsing towards this page, it will go ahead and come up in the web server logs over here. So if you want to see real-time streaming of your logs, you can go ahead and see it over here. Right, so in this chapter, I want to give an overview when it comes to the logs that are available when it comes to the Azure Web App. Now I want to go through the Azure App Configuration Service. So this is a separate resource that you can create in Azure, and it actually provides a central place where you can go ahead and manage app settings and also feature flags for your web applications. So if you had a set of web applications in Azure as part of the Azure Web App service, remember, for each Azure Web App, you have app settings in place that you can actually go ahead and set accordingly. But in case if you want to have a central place for the app settings for all of your Azure Web Apps, so maybe there might be a common setting for the Azure Web Apps, then you can actually go ahead and make use of the Azure App Configuration resource. There is also this concept of feature flags. Sometimes in the code base for your application, you might have feature flags in place. So using these feature flags, you might go ahead and simply enable or disable a feature. When you go ahead and let's say enable a feature, that feature might be available in your web application for your users. And then instead of actually going ahead and changing the code base to go ahead and remove that feature, you can just go ahead and disable that feature flag, and then automatically that feature will not be available. So we are going to go ahead and see how to make use of the Azure App Configuration Service. So firstly, in Azure, in all resources, let me go ahead and click on add. Over here, let me go ahead and search for app configuration. I'll go ahead and hit on create. Over here, I'll go ahead and choose my subscription. I'll go ahead and just choose a resource group. Over here, let me go ahead and just give a name for the resource, right? So it's available. I'll leave the location as it is. Now, when it comes to the pricing tier, so if you look at the full pricing details, so currently there are only two pricing tiers in place, the free and the standard. And for us, the free should be more than sufficient enough. Over here, you can only go ahead and create one per subscription, and this is the amount of storage you get. So this should be more than enough for our demo. So I'll go ahead and choose free. I'll go on to next for tags. I'll go on to review and create, and let me go ahead and hit on create. This might just take around 3 to 5 minutes. Let's come back once this is in place. Now, once the deployment is complete, so I'll go ahead onto the resource, and over here is where you can actually go ahead and manage your app settings. If you go on to Configuration Explorer, you'll basically go ahead and create something known as keys in the Configuration Explorer. Note that you could also have reference onto keys in a key vault, and then you will actually go on to Feature Manager to go ahead and work with your features. So now in the next chapter, let's go ahead and look at the first aspect wherein we'll work with the Configuration Explorer. Now in this chapter, let's go ahead and see how we can use the Configuration Explorer when it comes to the Azure App Configuration resource. So over here, let me go ahead and hit on create, and I'll go ahead and choose key value. Now over here in the name, let me go ahead and give a name for the key. So let's say I want to go ahead and store the database name. Let me go ahead and give a value, and let me go ahead and hit on apply. So now over here we have the configuration setting in place. Now let me go ahead and start up Visual Studio 2019. Let me go ahead and create a new project. Now over here, I can actually go ahead and search for ASP.NET Core. So I want to go ahead and again use the inbuilt templates. So I'll go ahead and choose ASP.NET Core Web App. Go on to next. So over here, let me go ahead and give a name for the web application. Let me go on to next. Over here, let me go ahead and hit on create. Now over here, if you want to go ahead and access that Azure App Configuration resource, the first thing we need to do is to go ahead and add a NuGet package. So I'll go on to the NuGet packages for the solution. I'll go on to browse. I'll go ahead and search for app configuration. And over here, I'm going to go ahead and choose Microsoft.Azure.app configuration. So over here, please note that this is the full package which is available for ASP.NET Core. So let me go ahead and select my project and go ahead and hit on install. I'll go ahead and hit on OK, and let me go ahead and hit on accept. Now, once this is done, let me go on to my program class. Over here, I need to ensure that I use now an instance of that app configuration so that whatever keys are defined in that Azure app configuration is available for my web application. So over here, in addition to also configuring the use of our startup class, I'm going to go ahead and enter some code. So I'm going ahead and using the method of the configure app configuration. And over here, I'm adding that Azure app configuration details. Now over here, we need to go ahead and add what is the connection string when it comes to the Azure app configuration. So over here in my Azure app configuration, let me go on to access keys. Over here, let me go ahead and click on show values. Now I can go ahead and take the connection string of the primary key. So I'll go ahead and copy the connection string, and I'll just place it over here. So now once this is done, those settings for the app configuration will now be available for the configuration object, which is available throughout our web application. So now I can go on to my pages. Let me go on to the index page just as an example. Over here, I need to also go ahead and add two directives. So I want to go ahead and now use the configuration service, which is available for .NET Core applications. And over here, we can now go ahead and reference those keys which are defined in the Azure app configuration. So over here, let me go ahead and just add a simple HTML code. over here, I'm seeing the name of the database is, I'm going ahead and making a reference onto the configuration. And then over here, I'm going ahead and giving the name of that key. Right, so with all of this in place, let me go ahead and run the application. Right, so over here, now you're getting the name of the database is AppDB. And remember, this is now coming in from the Configuration Explorer. It's coming in from the setting that you have over here. So now this is a setting that can be shared across multiple web applications. Now in this chapter, I want to show you how you can use feature flags. So over here, let me go on to Feature Manager, and over here, let me go ahead and just add a very simple feature flag. So over here, I'll just give a name of staging, and I won't enable this feature flag as of now. So feature flag is just a variable with a binary state of on or off. Do you want to enable that feature in your web application, or do you want to go ahead and disable that feature? We'll go ahead and see how to implement this via code. So first of all, let me go ahead and hit on apply so that I have that feature flag in place. Now let me go on to Visual Studio. Over here, let me go ahead and create now a new project. Over here, let me go ahead and again search for ASP.NET Core. Let me go ahead and scroll down because I want to go ahead and now choose an ASP Core web application that is based on the model view controller. Let me go on to next. So over here, let me go ahead and just give a name for the project. Go on to next, and let me go ahead and hit on create. So for our project, there are a couple of steps which remain the same. So first of all, we have to go on to NuGet Package Manager, manage NuGet packages for the solution. I'll go on to browse, and again, let me go ahead and search for app configuration. So again, I'll go ahead and choose Microsoft.Azure.appconfiguration.ASP.NET Core. I'll choose my project and hit on install. Now there is one more package that we need to install. So if I go back on to the NuGet package over here, let me go ahead and search for feature management. So over here, I want to go ahead and choose Microsoft.featuremanagement.ASP.NET Core. So I'll go ahead and choose that. I'll choose my project and hit on install. I'll hit on OK and hit on accept. Then next, again, I'll go on to my program class. So over here, let me go ahead and replace this code. So this code is required now when it comes to the Azure app configuration, when it comes to feature management. Again, let me go ahead and replace this connection string. Over here, you can see you're also making use of feature flags. So let me go ahead and delete this. I'll go on to my Azure app configuration resource. I'll go on to access keys. I'll go ahead and show the values. Again, I'll take the connection string and replace it over here. So over here in the startup class, I have to go on to my services, and I need to go ahead and add feature management. So if I just go over onto it, I need to go ahead and use Microsoft.featuremanagement. Now what I'll do is that let me go ahead and add code wherein we'll go ahead and display the details of the new feature. So the first thing I'll do is let me go ahead and basically add a new controller. So by default, as part of this template, you get a home controller. Let me go ahead and add a new controller. So I'll choose an MVC controller empty. I'll go on to add. And over here, let me go ahead and name this as feature controller. Click on add. Then in the new controller, let me go ahead and add a property for the feature manager. Let me go ahead and again choose using Microsoft.Feature Management. I can go ahead and also ensure that I have the constructor for the controller. And over here, I can also go ahead and again get a reference on to the feature manager. So over here, my property onto feature manager. Then for my index method, I am going to go ahead and add something known as a feature gate. So over here using Microsoft.featuremanagement.mvc. And then I need to also define an enumeration. So over here for my project, let me go ahead and right click and basically add a new class. So over here, let me go ahead and just give a simple name for the class. Click on add. Over here, I basically want to go ahead and define it as an enumeration. And over here, I'll just have one enumeration of staging. Let me go back onto my feature controller. So over here, I can say feature.staging. Right, so I have my controller in place. Now in my views, let me go ahead and first create a new folder. So this new folder has to be the same name as my controller. So that's feature. And then in this folder, let me go ahead and now add a new view. So this will be a razor view. I'll go on to add. Over here, I'll leave it as the index.cs HTML. Let me go ahead and click on add over here. And just to go ahead and make this simple, I'll go ahead and just give a simple HTML line of this is the staging website. Now we need to go ahead and ensure that users can actually go ahead and browse to this particular staging website. So we can go ahead and do this via the index page on our main home controller. So for the home folder, I'll go onto the index page. Now we need some way to ensure that users can actually go on to this new page. So for that, I'll go onto the shared folder. I'll go onto the common layout page that is available for all pages. And over here, let me go ahead and add lines of code. Over here, I'm going ahead and adding that feature name of staging. Now over here, I need to go ahead and give what is the name of my controller. So that's feature. And over here, the index page. And what I can do over here is I can go ahead and just give a name of new feature. So this will be a link. That link will actually go on to our new controller, which will go ahead and redirect us on to this page of this is a staging website. Let me go ahead and save all of this first. Now also to ensure, so if I go back onto the layout page, so by default, what should happen is that this feature should also be basically a tag helper. So you have tag helpers in ASP.NET Core. So over here, you have to go onto the view imports file and over here, add the tag helper for Microsoft.Feature Management. Let me go ahead and save this file. Now let me go back onto the layout page. And now over here, you can see the feature name in green. So that means it's now using that tag helper. Right, so now we have everything in place. Let me go ahead and run the application. Right, so over here you have this home page. Now over here you only see the links of home and privacy. Now if I go ahead on to the feature and if I go ahead and now enable the feature, so it's gone ahead and updated the feature flag. So now let me go ahead and stop the application. And now let me go ahead and run the application again. And now you can see the link of new feature. If you go ahead and click on it, you are redirected onto the staging website. So just with the enablement of one checkbox in that Azure app configuration, you now have this new feature link which is available in your application. Now please note that there is also an option to go ahead and add the middleware of feature management onto your startup class. Then you don't have the requirement of ensuring to stop and start your web application. Now in this chapter, I want to go ahead and talk about the auto-scaling feature, which is available as part of Azure Web Apps. It's actually part of the app service plan. Now, if you go ahead and opt for the standard app service plan or higher, you basically get a feature known as auto-scaling. So remember that your Azure Web Apps is part of an app service plan, and the app service plan basically hosts your web application on an underlying instance or a virtual machine. Now, let's say that a number of users are actually going ahead and accessing your web application. And let's say that because of the load on the web application, the load is also increasing on that underlying compute infrastructure. And now let's say it's actually becoming a bottleneck. So this could be either just for your one web application, or let's say for a set of web applications that are being hosted as part of the same app service plan. Now, in order to go ahead and alleviate this issue, you can go ahead and basically ensure that there is another instance that is made available so that the load gets distributed across these virtual machines. Now, as part of the basic app service plan, you can go ahead and scale up to 3 virtual machines or compute infrastructure. But this is a manual procedure, so you have to go ahead and do the scaling yourself. But in the world of automation, in order to ensure that the scaling happens automatically, you can actually go ahead and choose the standard app service plan or higher. Here you can actually go ahead and create rules and conditions to go ahead and trigger that scaling process. So for example, you can go ahead and create a condition based on the CPU percentage of the underlying compute infrastructure that is actually based on the app service plan. So if the CPU goes beyond a particular limit, it can go ahead and scale out the number of machines automatically. You can also go ahead and create scale in conditions because you need to have that in place as well. So if the load actually decreases, right, it becomes less, then it should go ahead and scale in the number of virtual machines so that you are billed less, the cost is less. Because the app service plan, the billing or the cost for the app service plan also depends upon the number of compute machines that you have running in the background. So the first important thing is that this auto scaling process is available in the standard app service plan or higher, and you can go ahead and create scaling conditions to go ahead and scale your infrastructure automatically. Now in the next chapter, we'll go ahead and look at an example on this. Now here I am in Azure. Now I have an existing Azure Web App in place. Now this web app is actually running based on the basic app service plan. And remember, as part of the basic app service plan, so if I go on to the scale out feature for this app service plan, for this web app basically, I have to do a manual scaling of the underlying instances that is hosting my web applications. But if I want to go ahead and enable auto scaling, I have to ensure that I'm using the standard app service plan or higher. So firstly, let me go on to scale up for the app service plan. And over here, I can actually go ahead and scale up my app service plan. So I'll go on to the production section, and over here, I'll go ahead and choose S1, that is the standard app service plan. So even if you go ahead and scroll down over here, you can see it has the feature of auto scaling. So let me go ahead and hit on apply. So I'm going ahead and updating my app service plan. This will just take a minute or two. Now, once the update is complete, so let me go on to the overview. So now I can see that it has the S1. That means it is part of the standard app service plan. Now let me go on to the scale out section, and over here I can do either a manual scaling. So I could go on to now actually 10 because that is now the limit for the standard app service plan. Or I could also do a custom auto scaling. And this custom auto scaling can be based on a condition. Now let me go ahead and just hide this so that we can have a better view of the scaling condition. So you can go ahead and create multiple scaling conditions. There is a default condition in place, and let's work with the same condition. Now you can actually go ahead and scale based on a metric over here. So we can actually go ahead and add a rule to this particular condition. Now in the rule, you can go ahead and decide, okay, what is this rule going to be based on to ensure that it performs the scaling process. So over here by default, it's going ahead and taking the CPU percentage of your app service plan, right? Not your web app, your app service plan. Because your app service plan is what is responsible for creating that underlying compute infrastructure. So if the underlying CPU percentage for your app service plan, let's say, goes beyond a particular threshold, you can go ahead and initiate the scaling process. Now, in addition to basing your metrics only on the app service plan, you can also base your metrics. If I go on to the metric source, you also have other resources in place as well. So there is an integration of this Azure Web App feature, the scaling web app feature, with other services in Azure as well. So it's not necessary that you only have to base your scaling based on the metrics of the app service plan. For the moment, let me go ahead and just choose the current resource. So if I go ahead and actually scroll down, so over here you can see the average CPU utilization. Now over here, you can go ahead and say, okay, if the CPU percentage is greater than 70%, then let's ensure that this rule gets triggered. Now just to go ahead and ensure that this rule actually gets triggered, I'm going to go ahead and choose another metric name. So I want to go ahead and choose the metric of memory percentage. And over here, I can see the percentage is always above, let's say 40%, or actually 50% in this case. So I'm going to say if the metric actually goes beyond 40%, because I want to ensure that this rule actually gets triggered. It will actually take the metrics over the last 10 minutes. And if the average is obviously greater than 40%, then over here you can say in the action, go ahead and increase the count by 1 instance. You also have something known as a cooldown period. So this is very important. So let's say that as part of your app service plan, you have 1 instance which is in the running state. Now let's say that the rule has been triggered, and now based on the load, it goes ahead and adds another machine. Now obviously it will take time for the load to be distributed across these 2 machines, and that is what is your cooldown period. So during this time, the scaling process should not take into account any metrics or thresholds that get breached, because over here during the cooldown period, you are actually allowing the load to be distributed across both the old and the new virtual machine, which is now part of the app service plan. So over here, you have to go ahead and decide what will be the appropriate value for the cooldown period. Now I'll leave everything as it is and click on add. Now over here, you can also go ahead and decide what should be the maximum number of instances that should actually run as part of the app service plan. I'll go ahead and mention it as 3. And then let me go ahead and click on save. So now it's going ahead and adding this auto scaling, or basically updating this auto scaling configuration. Let me go ahead and just expand this. Right, so now we have the scaling condition in place. Now let me wait for a period of 20 minutes and let's come back after some time. Now after some time, when you actually come back, if you go ahead and click on refresh, so if I go ahead and scroll down, so now over here you can see that you have an instance count of 3. So earlier on it would have been just an instance count of 1, and that's because now the alert is being triggered, right? The threshold is being reached, and that's why it's going ahead and scaling out the number of instances that are part of the app service plan. So if you go on to the run history, over here, if you go ahead and scroll down, so over here you can see the scale up result, and over here you can see that the scale up is completed. At the moment it's showing a capacity of 2, and that's because it has just probably gone ahead and started the creation of that third instance. Currently there are 2 instances in place, and probably it's going up and spinning up that third instance. After some time, you will also see an observed capacity over here has 3. Right, so in this chapter, I want to show you that auto scaling feature which is available as part of your Azure Web Apps. Now, in this chapter, I want to go through cost, that's cross-origin resource sharing. Now, by default, there is a security measure. I'm not talking about Azure. I'm talking about a security measure in general. So over here, let's say you have an API that is being hosted as part of a web application. And then you have another web application, this part of a different domain over here, that is trying to go ahead and access this API. So this is accessing data across domains. Now by default, when it comes to security measures, when it comes to your browser, you might not be able to go ahead and access the data in the other domain. And that's because of the security setting in the browser that's known as CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. So this is a method of restricting access onto resources on a web page when it is requested from another domain. Now to go ahead and explain how this feature actually works, we are going to go through the process of creating a simple API and creating another application that will go ahead and consume this API. And then we look at how to work with the cross-origin resource sharing feature, which is available as part of the Azure Web App service. So firstly, in Visual Studio, let me go ahead and create a new project. So this project will be used to go ahead and expose some information via APIs. Now I'm going to go ahead and again choose an ASP.NET Core empty based application. I'll go on to next. So over here, let me go ahead and give a name. I'll go on to next. I'll go ahead and hit on create. Now again, the first thing I'll do is to go ahead and create a folder known as models. Over here, I'll go ahead and just create a simple class that's known as the course class. So this will go ahead and represent the structure of my data. So I'll be keeping it very simple. Over here, I have the course ID and the course name. Then I'll go ahead and create a new services folder. Over here, I'll go ahead and just create a class So I'll name this as course service. And over here, I'll go ahead and just keep it simple. So I want to go ahead and create a list of courses. And over here, I'm going ahead and creating the course list in memory itself, in the program itself. And then I have a method to go ahead and get all of the courses, and it'll go ahead and return that list of courses. Now I'll go ahead and create a new folder for my API controller. So I'll name it as controllers. I'll go ahead and add a new controller. So I'll go ahead and choose an MVC controller, click on add. So I'll name this as the course controller, click on add over here. So I have to make sure this is an API controller, so it'll inherit from the controller base. Make sure I choose the attribute of the API controller. I'll go ahead and add the route also. There's one thing that I forgot. I have to go on to my startup class. And here let me go ahead and ensure to add the service of the controller and my course service as well. So I need to go ahead and ensure to use that namespace. So that is also fine. I'll go ahead and change the routing as well. So over here, since this is just an API, a simple mapping of the controllers will do. Now I'll go back onto my course controller class. And over here, let me go ahead and just replace this. So over here, I'm going ahead and using my course service class. Over here, I want to go ahead and return all the courses whenever a GET request is issued against this API. So over here, the route is /API/course. So now if I go ahead and run this in the browser, so on localhost, nothing will work. But if I go on to /API/course, so I'm getting all of the course information. So this is now our source project. Now in the next chapter, let's go ahead and build the project that is going to go ahead and consume this API. Now in the last chapter, we had gone ahead and create a simple web project that was actually based on an API. So when you went ahead and invoke a GET request on the API, it was returning some information. Now over here, I'm going to go ahead and create another project. This is for consuming the API. Now this is actually just a simple HTML page. Just for the sake of this demo, just to go ahead and explain, when it comes to cross-domain, when it comes to the CORS feature, I'm making it as part of an ASP.NET Core application. And then we're going to go ahead and publish both of our solutions onto separate Azure Web Apps. So over here, I'll go ahead and create a new project in Visual Studio. And again, I'll go ahead and choose ASP.NET Core empty. Over here, let me go ahead and give a name and hit on next. Let me go ahead and hit on create. So I'm going to go ahead and have a simple HTML page. So over here for the HTML page, so first of all, I'll go ahead and create a new folder. So www.root. So this is a special folder that is available in ASP.NET Core. So you can see that the symbol has changed. And over here, let me go ahead and just add a new item. So this will be an HTML page. So over here, I should be able to go ahead and find for an HTML page. Just give it a simple name and click on add. Now I'll go ahead and add some code onto this page. So over here, this is the code I'm going to be adding. So I'm making use of jQuery. And over here, I am going to go ahead and issue a GET request against my web app, which will be hosting our API based application. Please note that we still haven't gone ahead and published that onto Azure. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and publish our applications onto separate Azure Web Apps. Now to go ahead and save on time, I've gone ahead and deployed two Azure Web Apps. So one is the Consume Web App and the other is Source API. So both are based on the Windows platform. So let's go ahead and do that. So firstly, I'll go on to my source API. I'll hit on publish. I'll go ahead and choose Azure, click on next. Azure App Service, click on next. And over here, let me go ahead and choose the source API, hit on finish. And let me go ahead and hit on publish. I'll go on to my consume API. Now over here, I have to go ahead and give the name of our Azure Web App. So over here, it is source API. So I can go ahead and copy this onto the clipboard. And I can go ahead and just place it over here. So this should work. Let me go ahead and save this. Now within the code, the other thing that I need to do is, because these are static files in ASP.NET Core, I have to go on to my startup class and I have to ensure that I configure the use of static files. Let me go ahead and save all of this, and let me go ahead and now publish this onto Azure. So I'll go ahead and create a new publish profile. I'll go ahead and choose the consume web app and hit on finish. Let me go ahead and hit on publish over here. Now in a new tab, let me go on to settings. Let me go on to more tools. Over here, let me go on to developer tools. I'm currently on Chrome. Now, once the publish is complete, I'll go on to my consume web app. I'll go ahead and take the URL. I'll go on to a new tab and I'll go on to demo.html. And over here, you can see that I am not able to view the data that I want to view, and that's because of this CORS policy. So over here, you can see the request from one domain onto the other domain has been blocked by this CORS policy. So if you want to go ahead and now enable this, you have to go onto your source API. So this is the source application for which you are requesting data. So over here, if you go ahead and scroll down, there is in the API the setting known as CORS. Let me go ahead and hide this. I can go ahead and enable access control allow credentials. And over here, in terms of the origin, I can go ahead and choose the URL of my consume web app. And I can go ahead and place it over here. And then I can go ahead and click on save. Now, once this is done, let me go ahead and call this again. So now you can see that I'm actually getting the data over here. So now I'm able to successfully call my source API based on that CORS setting. And over here, you can see the information in the console.log. So in this set of chapters, I want to show you what is the benefit of using that CORS setting, which is available for Azure Web Apps. Now, just a quick note before we sign off. So when it comes to the perspective of the exam, it is also important to know the Azure command line interface to go ahead and add a URL when it comes to the CORS setting. So now in order to go ahead and add a URL that can go ahead and access the source API, over here, you need to go ahead and use AZ Web App CORS add command. And over here in the allowed origins, you can go ahead and add the origin which needs access onto that Azure Web App. So again, just from the perspective of the exam, want to give this important note. Now, in the next chapter, we are going to be looking at a feature that is available for Azure App Services, and that is deployment slots. So this is useful when you want to test out different versions of your application. So let's say that you have an application that is deployed onto an Azure Web App So let's say this is version 1 and this is a production version of your application. So all of your users are currently using this web application. Now let's say you have another version of your application and you now want to deploy it onto the same Azure Web App. Now, when it comes on to deploying newer versions of your application, one of the issues that can occur is what happens if the newer version does not work as desired. How easy it is to actually roll back onto the previous version. Is there any way that we can actually test out the newer version of the application? So one way to test out the newer version is to probably create another Azure Web App and then deploy it over there, test it out, and then promote again this version 2 onto your production-based web application. Well, with the help of the feature of deployment slots, this can be made much more easier. So here what happens is that you have your production version of your application deployed onto the Azure Web App. This is actually part of something known as a production slot. And then you can start creating multiple slots as part of the Azure Web App. So you could have something known as a staging slot. It's like having another Azure Web App within this web app itself. Then you can actually promote version 2 onto the slot. This slot gets its own DNS name. You can then test out this version of the application. And then when you're happy with the testing, what you can do is you can just perform a swap of both of the slots. So now version 2 will actually be the production-based version of your application that is running, and your users will be directed onto version 2. And here what happens is that if version 2 does not work, you can just do a swap back. So version 1 can then become the version that's running in your production-based Azure Web App. So with the help of slots, you can actually go ahead and deploy different versions of your application. One important note is if you want to use this particular feature, you have to ensure that you use the right app service plan. So here support is in place when you use the standard, the premium, and the isolated app service plan. Now in this chapter, I want to go through the working of deployment slots that we have in Azure Web Apps. Now currently I have a web app in place. This is part of an app service plan. So if I go ahead and just scroll down, if I go on to the app service plan that this web app is actually part of. So currently this web app is part of an app service plan that is based on the basic pricing tier. So firstly, if I go on to the overview for this web app, so if I go ahead and take the URL, if I go on to a new tab, so again, I have the default web application, which should be running as part of this Azure Web App. Now in Visual Studio, again, I have the simple ASP.NET Core web application that is based on the template available in Visual Studio. So firstly, let me go on to pages. Let me go on to the index page and let me go ahead and just add some text over here. I'll go ahead and save, and let me go ahead and publish this web application onto Azure. So I'll go on to next. I'll choose Azure App Service Windows. I'll go on to that web app and hit on finish. So let's wait till this is complete. In the meantime, if I go on to my web app, now if you want to go ahead and make use of deployment slots, you have to go on to deployment slots in the deployment center. Now over here, it's asking me to go ahead and upgrade onto a standard or premium plan. So this feature of deployment slots is not available with the basic app service plan. You need to go ahead and choose either the standard app service plan or higher. Now the way that you can actually go ahead and scale up your app service plan is to go ahead and scroll down. You can go ahead and again choose on scale up. That is your app service plan. And over here, I can go on to the production workload. Let me go ahead and just hide this. So I can go ahead and choose S1. That is the standard app service plan. If you go ahead and scroll down and if you look at the features, you can see that you have 5 staging slots as part of the standard app service plan. So you can go ahead and scale up and scale down at any point in time. So let me go ahead and hit on apply. So it's going ahead and updating the app service plan. Now in Visual Studio, let me go ahead and also hit on publish so that I publish at least our production app onto the web app that we have in Azure. Now once the publish is complete, so if I go ahead and refresh this page, I should see my production application over here. Now let me go ahead and expand this. Let me go back onto the overview. Now over here, I can see that my web app is now part of the standard app service plan. Now let me go on to deployment slots. And over here, now I should have the ability to go ahead and add a slot. So by default, now you have your main web application running as part of something known as a production slot. So now let's say you want to go ahead and deploy a newer version of your application, but before they can be actually accessed by your users in your production-based environment, you want to go ahead and test that version of the application. You can actually go ahead and add first a deployment slot. You can then go ahead and publish the newer version of your application onto that deployment slot. And then in the end, you can actually go ahead and swap your production and your new deployment slot. So over here, let me go ahead and first add a new slot. Over here, I'll give the name of staging. And if you want, you can go ahead and copy some of these settings which are available with your production web app slot, your production slot itself. For now, I'll just leave everything as it is. And let me go ahead and click on add. This will just take a minute or two. Now, once we have the slot in place, let me go ahead and hit on close. So now you can see your production staging slot in place. So if you go ahead and actually now click on it, it actually goes ahead and shows you another page. This is like having another Azure Web App itself, but this is nothing but a slot in your existing Azure Web App. So instead of actually going ahead and creating a new Azure Web App, you're creating a slot, which is like creating another Azure Web App within the original web app itself. It also has its own unique URL. So if you go ahead and copy this onto the clipboard, if you go on to another tab, so it just goes ahead and basically adds in the URL the name of the slot. So now in Visual Studio, if I go ahead onto my pages, so let me go on to the index page, and over here, let me go ahead and just make a small change. So I'll say version 1. And now what I'll do is that let me go ahead and right click on my project and let me go ahead and hit on publish. Now over here, let me go ahead and actually create now a new publish profile. So over here, I'll go ahead and hit on new. So I'll choose Azure, go on to next. Again, Azure App Service, go on to next. Now over here, let me go ahead and choose my production app. And now I can see this feature of deployment slots. So now instead of actually promoting my new version of the application onto my existing version, which might be an issue because I want to test my new version, or rather than promoting it onto another Azure Web App, I can go ahead and deploy it onto this new deployment slot. So I'll go ahead and hit on finish. So again, let me wait for a minute or two. Now let me go ahead and hit on publish. and let's wait for the publish to complete. Now once the publish is complete, so if I go ahead and now refresh this page, so I have welcome to production application version 1. So now you might go ahead and give this on to some of your users for testing purposes. And once the testing is complete, once you're sure, this should be now promoted as the new version of your application. So you want to ensure that this URL now points on to this new version of your application. You can just go ahead and perform a quick swap of your production and your new deployment slot. So again, that's very simple. So over here, you can go on to either slot, your production slot or your new staging slot, your new deployment slot, and you can go ahead and click on swap. So over here, it's going ahead and doing a swap of the staging slot with your production slot. Let me go ahead and click on swap over here. Now this swap process will take around 3 to 5 minutes. So normally in your production-based environments, you will definitely have a time span of a few minutes wherein changes are promoted onto your new production site. So even over here, this will just take around 3 to 5 minutes. So let's wait till this is complete. Now, once a swap is complete, if I go on to my main production app page, let me go ahead and hit on enter to go ahead and refresh this page. And now we can see welcome to production application version 1. And if I go on to the one which has my staging slot, my staging version of the application, I should now see the older version of my application, which is welcome onto production application. So over here, I want to show you how you can make use of deployment slots when it comes to hosting new version of your application and then going ahead and swapping that with the existing version of your application.